Philosophy of Mind, Lecture 6, Computer Minds.
In the last lecture, we looked at functionalism, the theory that mental states are functional states, that is, states defined by their causes and effects, and not by the particular physical material in which they might be realized or instantiated. One of functionalism's primary advantages was precisely that it permits multiple realizability, that is, the possibility that creatures with very different brain structures might nevertheless be able to be in exactly the same mental states. And not just brain structures. In fact, any physical substrate might do, as long as it can be in states with the appropriate causal roles. And so functionalism lays the theoretical groundwork for the very possibility that computers might be endowed with genuine mental states. Computers differ physically from our brains in many ways, but if the physical constitution doesn't matter, then nothing prevents their being programmed to have minds. So functionalism lays the groundwork for the possibility of artificial intelligence. In this lecture, we'll explore this possibility in some detail. The surprisingly long history of artificial intelligence. You would be surprised at just how far back key elements of the project to create artificial intelligence actually go. Indeed, important contributions to the development of artificial intelligence can be traced as far back as the great ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, who lived in the 4th century BCE. For Aristotle was perhaps the first to propose that logic, which is the backbone of rational thinking, can be formalized. To say that logic can be formalized is to say that good and bad arguments come in well-defined patterns that can be represented by symbols. For example, if you believe that all animals are mortal and that all human beings are animals, then you must believe, at least rationally speaking, that all human beings are mortal. This is what's called a valid argument. If its two premises are true, then its conclusion will have to be true. But now Aristotle's insight is that if this particular argument, which happens to be about humans, animals, and mortality, is a valid one, then every argument which has the same formal structure as this one would also be valid. What is the formal structure of this argument? We may see that by representing the argument in symbols, such as these. All A are M, all H are A, therefore all H are M. More generally, any argument which has the form all X's are Y's, all W's are X's, therefore all W's are Y's, will be a valid argument. It doesn't matter what the particular argument might be about, humans, animals, mortality, or anything else. All that matters is the structure or form of the argument. For Aristotle to have formalized logic, then, is for him to have attempted to discover all the good and bad kinds of reasoning and to describe them in these symbolic ways. And the key idea would be that thinking, both good thinking, rational thinking, and bad thinking, that is, non-rational or irrational, might ultimately be a matter merely of moving symbols around in various describable forms or patterns. So that's the very beginning of the idea of artificial intelligence. The more recent but still pretty distant history of artificial intelligence. Lots of thinkers made various contributions to the study of formal logic over the centuries, but the next major steps in the project of artificial intelligence consisted in attempts to build purely mechanical devices, machines, capable of doing different sorts of mathematical calculations. In the 16th century, for example, a Scottish man named John Napier invented what's called Napier's bones, a set of ivory sticks that could be used to calculate additions and multiplications. The 17th century saw the production of still other machines capable of computing arithmetic. One example comes from the French thinker Blaise Pascal, most famous for an ingenious argument for the existence of God known as Pascal's wager, but in addition he also designed a mechanical calculator called the Pascaline, which it was said could do the work of six accountants, six 17th century accountants anyway, a prospect that was so potentially harmful to the employment rate that his machine did not catch on commercially. And in the 1670s, the German philosopher and mathematician Leibniz, whose principle of identity, Leibniz's law, we discussed in Lecture 4, invented a mechanical device capable of doing addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division using a particular mechanism that remained in use for almost 3 centuries. The next major milestones in the more recent but still pretty distant history of artificial intelligence occur 2 centuries later due to the 19th century English mathematician, inventor, and general eccentric Charles Babbage. In his day, mathematical tables were calculated by human beings who were called computers, as in those who compute. Babbage was impressed, or perhaps unimpressed, with the high rate of error of this process, and so he aimed to design machines which could do mathematical calculations more accurately. His first major effort in this direction was called a difference engine, and it stood 8 feet high, weighed about 15 tons, and was composed of 25,000 parts, and that was without quite being finished. Compare that to today's laptops. He later designed a second difference engine, which was not built until almost a century and a half after his death. Impressively, this one could perform its calculations out to 31 digits, far more than even today's average modern pocket calculator. Interestingly, between the 2 difference engines, he began designing an even more complicated machine called the analytical engine, which could actually be programmed to do different calculations by inserting different series of punch cards. Now, our final stop in the prehistory of artificial intelligence occurs in the early 20th century. Bertrand Russell, who was a British philosopher, logician, mathematician, essayist, war protester, and just all-around brilliant thinker, teamed together with a man named Alfred North Whitehead, who was another British philosopher, logician, and mathematician, to produce a 3-volume masterpiece called Principia Mathematica, the Principles of Mathematics. In this groundbreaking work, they aimed to show that all mathematics was reducible to some basic bits of logic, that all mathematical ideas could actually be expressed in the same kind of logical symbolization that we mentioned earlier when talking about Aristotle. If so, then in principle all mathematical calculations and theorems could be computable and provable by purely mechanical processes, by computation. And if the essence of thinking is just to be expressed by logic, then in principle all thinking too could be explained in purely mechanical terms, as the manipulation of symbols according to well-defined rules. Or, in other words, all thinking could be explained as a form of computation. Thus the idea was born of the mind as being a kind of computer, and of the possibility, in reverse, of a computer being programmed so as to have a mind. Alan Turing and the Foundations of Artificial Intelligence. This now brings us to one of the most important and surprisingly relatively unknown people in the 20th century, another British mathematician and logician named Alan Turing. What makes him so important are 2 things. First, Turing played a key role in cracking the Nazi code system for radio transmissions, thus allowing the Allies to intercept and decode key Nazi military communications, and thus yielding the Allies incalculable advantages in the prosecution of World War II. And second, Turing did the key theoretical work elaborating the very concept of a computation, for which reason he is generally considered to be the father of the modern computer. But given the connections we were just describing between thinking as a kind of logic and thus as ultimately something computable, it's no surprise that the idea of a computer having a mind was one which Turing himself carefully considered. In a landmark article in 1950 called Computing Machinery and Intelligence, Turing explicitly addressed the question, can machines think? He quickly realized that answering the question required careful analysis of the meanings of the concepts of machines and thinking, and indeed proposed that the question so formulated was too imprecise to be useful. In its place, he offered some alternative questions which he felt were less ambiguous. And in so doing, he bequeathed to us a very important criterion for determining whether a machine, a computer, may genuinely be said to have a mind or mental states. The criterion, in short, is whether the computer is capable of passing what is now known as the Turing test. Turing describes the test in terms of a kind of party game. The game is played with 3 people, a man, a woman, and an interrogator who may be of either sex. The object of the game is for the interrogator to determine which of the other 2 is the man and which is the woman. But there's a catch. The man and woman are locked away in separate rooms, and can communicate with the interrogator only in writing by slipping notes under the door. Further, the man's goal in the game is to mislead the interrogator into reaching the wrong conclusion, while the woman's goal is to help the interrogator reach the correct conclusion. So the woman might slip out a note saying, "I am the woman," but then again, given the man's goal to mislead the interrogator, he could slip out the same note from the other room. Sounds like fun? Well, you might want to think of the kinds of questions you, as an interrogator, would ask in order to figure out which room holds the man and which holds the woman. What now does this have to do with the question of computer minds? Well, Turing now asks, quote, "What will happen when a machine takes the part of the man in this game? Will the interrogator decide wrongly as often when the game is played like this, as he does when the game is played between a man and a woman? These questions replace our original 'Can machines think?' End quote." Or to put the whole thing a little bit more simply, the question here is whether a computer could ever be programmed in such a way that its behavior could fool a human interrogator into thinking that the computer was in fact a person. A computer passes the Turing test when its behavior, its output as it were, is in well-defined circumstances indistinguishable from that of another human being to an average human observer. And the idea is that a computer would count as being intelligent, genuinely having a mind or mental states, when its behavior is indistinguishable from that of a human being. Interestingly, Turing himself predicted that computers would be able to pass the Turing test by the end of the 20th century. In his 1950 paper, he wrote, quote, "I believe that in about 50 years' time it will be possible to program computers to make them play this imitation game so well that an average interrogator will not have more than 70% chance of making the right identification after 5 minutes of questioning." End quote. And indeed, since 1990, in fact, there's been an annual Turing test competition known as the Loebner Prize competition, in which programmers submit programs designed to fool judges. The best program each year has won in recent years $3,000, but regretfully, no program has yet been judged to have won the grand prize of $100,000, a prize to be earned when, in effect, a program's responses simply cannot be distinguished from those of a human being. Turing's prediction, in other words, was wrong. Despite an impressive number of programs capable of doing very impressive things, no program has yet passed the bona fide full-blown Turing test. Some objections to the Turing test now, and replies to those objections. Failure to create a program that can behave indistinguishably from a person does not mean, of course, that computers cannot be intelligent or have genuine mental states. It means merely, at most, that the task of so programming a computer is a very difficult one, which shouldn't be all that surprising if you think about it. But still, the failure to pass the Turing test to this day does suggest the possibility that no computer would ever be capable of genuine mentality. And indeed, that no computer could be capable of genuine mentality is an intuition that many people have, even today. And all the more so back in 1950 when Turing was writing and when computers were room-sized monstrosities with no obvious commercial applications. In fact, in Turing's article, he considers a number of objections to his prediction that in time computers would pass the Turing test. There's first a theological objection, that God gives a soul to human beings but not to any other animals or machines. To this objection, Turing offers first a theological response. Well, why exactly might not God confer a soul on any being capable of the right sort of functioning? And if computer behavior were indistinguishable from ours, why exactly wouldn't that be the right sort of functioning? And he then offers, in addition, a non-theological response. Theological arguments, he notes, have often been unsatisfactory in the past, being used, for just one example, to refute the claim that the Earth goes around the Sun, a claim which science has amply demonstrated. So Turing suggests we shouldn't lay too much weight on theological objections. Moving on, there are various objections based on different disabilities. That is, claims that no computer would be able to do X, where X might include such things as being kind, resourceful, friendly, falling in love, doing something truly original, and so forth. To many of these, Turing offers specific replies, but a couple of general strategies stand out. For example, most of these denials are offered without any defense or argument. It's easy to say that a computer would never fall in love, but of course we need some actual argument before we simply accept that. And further, most of these denials in Turing's time were made when computer technology was in its infancy. It may well be that early computers, or even the computers in existence now in the 21st century, are not yet capable of displaying some of these abilities, but that's hardly an argument that no machine ever will or could display them. And finally, many of these abilities seem rather irrelevant or even frivolous, according to Turing. You might correctly object that no computer will ever be able to enjoy the taste of strawberries, but as Turing puts it, quote, any attempt to make a computer do so would be idiotic, end quote. At the least, the inability to enjoy strawberries hardly seems the correct criterion for whether a computer might count as genuinely having a mind. Finally, and probably most importantly, is what Turing calls the argument from consciousness. He quotes an objector as saying this, quote, not until a machine can write a sonnet or compose a concerto because of thoughts and emotions felt, and not by the chance fall or manipulation of symbols, could we agree that machine equals brain, end quote. The underlying idea here seems to be this, that what computers do is simply process symbols, much like the way Aristotle saw formal logic as the manipulation of symbols. The processing of symbols might well one day imitate various human behaviors, maybe even those as complex as the writing of a sonnet or a concerto. But such a production would just be an engineering tour de force, something capable of beautifully simulating human behavior without itself actually possessing the mental states with which we generate those behaviors. In a similar way, we might say a computer model of a hurricane might simulate a real hurricane without actually being one itself. And just as a computer hurricane model is a far cry from an actual hurricane, so too, the objector claims, a computer model of human behavior, even of human mentality, would be a far cry from actual mentality. Now, this objection is a profound one, for it challenges the validity of the Turing test itself. Even if a program should pass the test, in other words, we have no indication that it does so by virtue of genuinely possessing mental states. It's only imitating mentality, not genuinely having it. So why should we even bother with the Turing test at all? In response, Turing observes that the most extreme form of such an objection would be the view that, quote, the only way by which one could be sure that a computer thinks is to be the computer and to feel oneself thinking, end quote. And of course, that is simply an unanswerable objection, for no one is capable of being that computer and feeling it think. But it's also clear that this extreme form of the objection is simply too extreme, for it would apply equally to our judgments about whether other human beings have genuine minds. After all, the only evidence we actually have that others have minds is their behavior, and you could just as well insist that perhaps all other people are merely mechanical devices simulating your behavior, but doing so without the benefit of genuine mental states, of thoughts and feelings and consciousness on the inside, as it were. The only answer we could give to that is to say that the only way to know if anyone else truly has a mind is to be them and to feel their thinking, which is obviously impossible. But then again, almost no one is inclined to take this position. We have, in fact, no genuine doubts about whether other human beings, have minds. And what that indicates is that we take their behavior as sufficient evidence for their possessing minds. And given that fact, it would seem rather unreasonable to demand any more with respect to computer mentality. So the Turing test, in other words, is a legitimate test of mentality, for it's the very thing we use every day, all our lives, on the basis of which we ascribe minds to other human beings. So if a computer program should ever pass the Turing test, that is, behave in ways indistinguishable from our own, then Turing concludes we must accept computer mentality, that computers genuinely have minds in just the same sense that we do. Or so it seemed, at least, until 1980, when Berkeley philosopher John Searle published his notorious landmark article, Minds, Brains, and Programs. This article, as we mentioned in the last lecture, was originally published along with numerous objections by many leading thinkers, as well as Searle's replies to those objections. And this debate was a significant debate throughout much of the 1980s and 1990s in particular. The heart of Searle's article is a thought experiment, which we'll explore in a moment. And in this thought experiment, he imagines a system that's functionally equivalent to a person, by which is meant that its behavior was indistinguishable from that of a human being with genuine mentality. But, Searle will argue, it could be shown that this system merely mimics genuine mentality, but does not truly possess it. What Searle offered, in other words, was not merely the insistence that a computer's human-like behavior would not be sufficient to ascribe mentality to computers, as Turing's original objector did. Instead, Searle offers a rather vivid argument that human-like behavior in a computer is not sufficient for the computer to genuinely have mentality. And so Searle offers a bona fide objection to the Turing test as a very criterion of mentality. And with it, the fireworks begin. Let's begin with Searle's distinction between weak and strong artificial intelligence. Weak AI, as he refers to it, is just the idea that computers can be very useful tools in helping us understand the mind. Searle has no objections to this idea, and it's undeniable that computers play such a role to researchers in cognitive science. But strong AI, strong artificial intelligence, is the idea that computers can, when properly programmed, count as genuinely, truly having minds or mental properties. It's the idea that the mind stands to the brain just as a program stands to the computer hardware, and it's this idea which Searle is challenging. Crucial to strong AI, of course, is an understanding of just what a computer is, just what constitutes something as being a computer. Developing that Aristotelian insight, Searle notes that key to the concept of a computer is that its operations can be specified purely formally. That is, we can understand its activities in terms of purely formal symbols being manipulated according to rules. And what purely formal symbols are symbols which are specified without any reference to their semantics, that is, to what they mean. So, for example, a typical computer program will specify that when the machine is in a certain state or condition and a certain pattern of electrical activity is occurring, a symbol is present, then it should perform some operation, such as change the electrical activity, and move into another state. What's crucial here is that everything is specified formally, without reference to anything meaningful, to meanings. Certain patterns of electricity are replaced by other patterns, and nothing is said about what those patterns might represent or stand for or be about. But now, Searle argues, this key feature of programs, that they're defined in terms of formal symbols without reference to meanings, is fatal to the idea that mental processes are just kinds of programs. For as he's about to show, there's a crucial difference between genuine mental processes and programs. Mental processes are meaningful. They have meanings. They're about things. Your intentional states, your thoughts, beliefs, desires, and so on, are thoughts about things, beliefs about things, as we've seen in discussing intentionality. Mentality, in other words, crucially involves a semantic component, meaningfulness, the very thing that computer programs, by definition, lack. So now, let's turn finally to Searle's famous thought experiment. The Chinese room. Imagine first, Searle asks, that some computer programmers have written a program to simulate the understanding of Chinese. When one types in a question in Chinese, it produces appropriate answers to the question in Chinese. And let's imagine it does so well that it passes the Turing test and can fool even native Chinese speakers into believing that they're having a conversation with a genuine person. The claim of strong artificial intelligence is, in effect, that such a computer genuinely has mental properties and thus genuinely, truly understands Chinese. But now, Searle replies, imagine you are locked in a room along with some baskets filled with Chinese symbols. Symbols you don't understand, not being a speaker of Chinese, we'll assume. Through a slot in the door come slips of paper with Chinese symbols on them. You don't understand these slips, but you do have a little rule book in English which tells you what to do with them. But of course there's a catch. They specify what to do only formally, that is, without reference to semantics or meanings. So a rule might say something like this. When a squiggle of this shape comes in, take a squoggle from basket number 2, put it on a slip of paper, and pass it back out. Then some squiggles come in, and you send back out whatever corresponding squaggles the book tells you to send out, and so on. Nothing tells you what these squiggles, squaggles, squiggles mean. You're just following these meaningless rules, purely mechanically, we might say. But now imagine, Searle continues, the symbols being passed into the room are called questions by the native Chinese speakers outside the room, and the symbols you're passing back out are called answers. And imagine further that the programmers who wrote the rule book were so talented that the answers you've been sending out are indistinguishable from those of a native Chinese speaker. Imagine, in other words, that your activities in this room amount to passing the Turing test. The people outside believe they're having a genuine conversation with a genuine Chinese speaker. All that, and yet, pretty clearly, you don't understand a word of Chinese. The conclusions seem pretty clear. First, passing the Turing test cannot be sufficient for genuinely having mental properties, for here's a system which passes the Turing test with respect to understanding Chinese, and yet does not truly genuinely understand Chinese. But more importantly, second, we can see precisely why a computer's passing the Turing test isn't sufficient for its having genuine mentality. For what a computer does is merely process meaningless symbols, as you were doing in the room, while genuine mentality involves possessing semantics or meanings. And if following this purely formal program for manipulating symbols wasn't enough to make you count as genuinely understanding Chinese, then it wouldn't be enough to make any computer count. For no computer running some program has anything that you don't have when you're in that room manipulating those symbols. In short, then, genuine understanding involves grasping meanings, while programs involve just manipulating meaningless symbols. So no program alone could ever count as having genuine understanding. Simulating understanding, fine. Mimicking it, fine. But having it, not so. No more than a computer simulation of a hurricane is genuinely itself a real hurricane. So much the worse, then, for strong artificial intelligence, concludes Searle. Objections to the Chinese room thought experiment. The firestorm was ignited. Everyone and his brother and sister and mother and father had something to say about Searle's thought experiment. The objections came from every direction, from every discipline, including researchers in artificial intelligence, as well as researchers in psychology and cognitive science and philosophy. But as Searle liked to put it, all of these responses had something in common. They were all inadequate. And the reason they're inadequate, he tells us, is that the argument he gave rested on a very simple truth, namely that formal symbols are not sufficient for meanings, and computer programs only deal with formal symbols. Nevertheless, let's take a look at some of the more important objections to Searle, followed by a glance at Searle's particular responses to these objections. The first one, probably the most popular one, is called the systems objection. According to this objection, it claims that Searle's thought experiment wrongly focuses all of our attention on the person in the room manipulating the symbols, who clearly doesn't genuinely understand Chinese. But, the objection goes, there's more to the computer than just the person in the room. Rather, there's the whole system in place, a system consisting of that person, but also of the room, the baskets full of symbols, and of course, the rule book containing the program specifying which symbols should be output given the various symbols being input. The objection then is this. The person may not understand Chinese alone in isolation any more than some single element or circuit of a computer would count as understanding Chinese. Rather, it's the system as a whole, including the rulebook, which understands Chinese. Now, surely there's something intuitive to this objection, for if the rulebook enables the person to pass the Turing test, we may well be inclined to say that it incorporates genuine understanding of Chinese in some sense or another. And so we may be inclined to say that the person, along with the rulebook, together do count as understanding Chinese, just as we might say that the properly programmed computer as a whole understands Chinese, even if no single element or circuit of it counts as understanding Chinese. And note, we're perfectly comfortable saying that some native Chinese speaker generally understands Chinese, even as we acknowledge that no single component of that speaker, no single neuron, say, understands Chinese. Objection number 2 is called the robot objection, and this is perhaps the second most popular objection to Searle. The idea here is that Searle's thought experiment does show that a certain kind of system doesn't genuinely understand Chinese, but that this kind of system isn't one that anyone would think could genuinely understand Chinese anyway. Rather, a more realistic system involves more than merely answering questions in Chinese, but rather a whole spectrum of behaviors, the ability to move around in the world, perform various tasks, and so on, including understanding language. In short, what we should consider is a computer program which operates a robot, a device which, when you ask it to pass the salt, can actually move to pass the salt. Such a program would have real causal interactions with the items in the world, and if such a program could be written, which could successfully operate a robot which could then pass a real Turing test by navigating the world, then we'd have no reason to deny genuine mentality to those programs. In short, then, Searle's thought experiment does describe a program which is purely formal, lacks all semantics and meanings, and so no wonder it doesn't genuinely understand. But if a program could enable a robot to pass a full-bodied Turing test in the world, then such a program's symbols would be meaningful by virtue of their real-world causal interactions, and such a system, the objector concludes, would count as having genuine mentality. So, two objections, systems objection and the robot objection. Let's turn to Searle's responses. To the systems objection. This one, again, held that we shouldn't say the person in the room understands Chinese, but the system as a whole does, which includes the person plus the rulebook. Searle's response is simple. Imagine that you in the room have memorized the rulebook. Indeed, you might go even further and imagine that you've memorized all the symbols too and have even learned how to write them. In these circumstances, Searle notes, you're no longer separate from these other components of the system as a whole. Rather, you now are the system. You've internalized it. Everything in the system is now in you. And once you've done this, you'll notice something else. You still don't understand Chinese. What you know how to do is to send back out certain squiggles when certain squaggles come in. But what you don't know is what any of these mean. You might even make this even more dramatic. Instead of written symbols, imagine constructing the thought experiment with sounds. When you hear certain sounds, the rule specifies that you should send certain sounds back out. Then you memorize the whole system, so when a native Chinese speaker says something to you, you're able to produce an appropriate verbal response back out. You pass the Turing test. Your responses are indistinguishable from those of a native speaker, except for one thing. You still don't understand Chinese. And why not? Because, as Searle reiterates, you're still just dealing with formal symbols and rules for manipulating them. What's lacking is the meaning, the semantics. And no amount of meaningless symbol manipulation, meaningless sound manipulation, will ever tell you what these symbols mean, even if you're managing to omit the right symbols in the right circumstances. And that's all the system as a whole is dealing with, meaningless symbols. So not only don't you genuinely understand Chinese, as in the original thought experiment, neither does the system as a whole. So much for the systems objection. What about the robot objection? This one held that genuinely having a mind requires being embodied and causally interacting with the world, which will give the symbols meaning. Searle's response here is similar to his earlier responses. Imagine you're back in the Chinese room, manipulating those meaningless squiggles. But now, unbeknownst to you, some of these incoming symbols are generated by television cameras attached to a robot's head or eyes, and some of your outgoing symbols cause robotic arms and legs to move in various ways. Imagine, in other words, that the Chinese room simply is hooked up to and navigating a robot through the world. What you'll instantly notice is that this doesn't make the slightest bit of difference. You still don't understand a word of Chinese, even if the system is now embodied and navigating the world. And why not? Same reason. All you're dealing with are meaningless symbols. Being hooked up to the world in these causal ways still does nothing to confer meanings on those symbols. And without meanings, there are no minds, there are no mental states, there is no genuine understanding. So the robot objection is also diffused, and so much the worse for strong artificial intelligence. In this lecture, we've looked at the project of artificial intelligence, at the claim that properly programmed computers could count as genuinely having minds, which which is also the claim that our minds themselves are just like programs running on our brains. We saw this idea traces all the way back to Aristotle. We discussed the work of Alan Turing, examining in particular the famous Turing test he offered as a criterion for determining whether a machine counts as having a mind. We looked at various objections and replies to the Turing test, most notably the famous Chinese room thought experiment of John Searle, which didn't merely insist that no computer could have a mind, but gave a very dramatic argument as to why not. All computers deal with are meaningless symbols and rules for manipulating them, but mentality is a matter of meanings and semantics. We looked at some objections to Searle and then his replies, and we are going to be left, unfortunately, with a certain degree of skepticism about the possibility of computers genuinely having minds. But at least that skepticism comes along with making some progress in our attempt to understand the nature of the mind. What seems essential to minds is their ability to grasp meanings, to be in genuinely meaningful states. This idea became the central topic of discussion in the philosophy of mind in the last part of the 20th century. We'll explore it in great detail starting with Lecture 8, but before we get there, we need to turn the clock back just a little bit and grapple with the classic problem of mind-body causation. That will be the topic of our next lecture.
This ends Lecture 6. If you borrowed this course from a public library and would like your own copy of the course guide for future reference, call Recorded Books at 1-800-636-3399 and we'll send you a free copy. A shipping charge will apply.